off, please, and proposition team will start the timer when you go, okay?
Can you turn the...
No, because in my hand's like in the way. Just move over.
Can I start? Okay. Let's be very clear. For better or for worse, the relationship in families is changing around the world. There is growing individuality across the world as liberal values are being promoted across the world, especially in Eastern nations in which they have not been as prevalent until recently. We need to understand first why this is the case. This is because children are increasingly moving away from their parents, especially in countries like China, towards the big cities, towards places where they think they have more opportunities. And along with the physical distance that they are increasing with their parents, there's also an increasing emotional distance. They are now further from their parents in terms of their emotional relationship, and so we don't think parents are getting the care that they deserve. People are also living longer, which makes it very difficult to save for retirement. We look at schemes like the CPF in Singapore, which is seen as one of the best retirement funds in the entire world. But people are still unable to save enough for their retirement because they are living longer, healthcare costs are going up, they need to pay more money for infrastructure, more taxes. All of these things are contributing to an increasing burden on the standard of life for parents. Our policy to mitigate this falls under 4 tiers. First, we are going to try our best to ensure that that parents have a dignified standard of living that they deserve, and children are going to be responsible for that. So when we have children who have the ability to pay, this is our second tier, when children have the ability to pay, they have an obligation to do so. And this is where we are going to actually settle disputes between children and parents through arbitration, which isn't inside a court, which isn't an adversarial process because we have mediators trained to do it, and it also has extremely low costs, things that are not associated with the court system, which is extremely expensive. So we are going to avoid that entirely. Now, the fourth sub-tier to this is that it doesn't apply to abusive parents. We think this is out of the scope of this debate because there are laws on abusive parents that already exist, and we are going to keep those in place on both sides. If a parent is literally beating their child, that is not going to be in the scope of this debate because that is already illegal in status quo, and we're already going to ban it. Now, the fundamental question that we need to answer in this debate is how do we ensure parents have the standard of living they deserve after their time devoting their entire lives to their kids? They have spent so long caring for them. How do we ensure that they get the standard of living that they deserve for that care? 2 substantive arguments for the House today. First, on reciprocity, whether or not children have an obligation to pay. Secondly, that family is the best actor to do so, the best actor to care for parents. Now, on my first substantive on the concept of reciprocity, the thesis of this point is that children have an obligation to care for their parents, which is born out of the fact that parents have devoted their entire lives caring for their kids. I have 3 subpoints to this analysis. First, that parents have given their all for their kids because they've spent years providing education, shelter, etc. Even if they're just doing these things, which we think are the bare minimum that they need to do in order to not be negligent for their children's growth, they are at least providing the bare minimum, and so we think children should be obligated to give the bare minimum back. Even if children did not consent to being born, we think that they still have an obligation to care for their parents because they have received the bare minimum. They have received education. They have received all these things, and so they have an obligation to ensure that their parents aren't living a life that is extremely harmful to them, the kind of life that they deserve, in other words. So this leads me into the next subpoint to this substantive, which is the idea that children have a responsibility because children are the best stakeholder who we can point to. So we don't think, I'll take you in a second, sir, we don't think that this is likely to lead to any sort of harms because children are the most likely stakeholder to whom we can point that obligation. But I'm going to take your point.
You're saying that healthcare and welfare services for parents is increasing at the same time as you're claiming that the living standards for parents are decreasing. You cannot have it both ways. So could you please explain how that delineates on your side? Thank you.
We are saying that healthcare costs are increasing. We are saying that people are living longer. We are saying that life expectancies are getting longer. And so this makes it very difficult for them to save for their retirement, to save for these periods. When the healthcare system improves, recognize that it also becomes more expensive. And so the burden should fall on children to take that burden on and to actually care for their parents, as I've explained in my first layer of analysis. Now, we think that children are the group that are most likely to have benefited from their parents' effort, and so they are the best stakeholder to actually compensate for that effort. Because recognize that when children receive the bare minimum, even if they don't receive anything beyond the bare minimum, they are the group that has received the most effort from their parents, because they have spent 18 years of their life at least with a roof over their head, with education, with being able to get a high school diploma. These are things that their parents directly contribute to. And we don't think that their parents contribute to anyone else in society nearly as much as the children receive from their parents. And so when we see this, we think that the obligation should fall on the actor which has received the most tangible benefit from the parents. And if that is the children which we are positing to you, that is the group that should shoulder the burden. Now I'm going to move on to my second substantive, which is the idea that family is the best caretaker to actually take care of their parents. And so the thesis of this point is that the family unit is the best way to protect parents in times of need. Two subpoints for the substantive. First, that children best know their parents, and second, that generalized care is always worse and more expensive. So first, children best know their parents because they are most likely to have a close relationship with their parent. Even if they are moving away, as I explained earlier, we think that they are still the actor which has the closest relationship to their parent. No one else is close as children are because of the biological relationship. Children understand their parents' needs best, therefore, so they are able to best respond to it. They can do things preemptively. This is the distinction between our side and theirs, because children can actually respond to things before they even happen. They can understand that parents have had a history of certain medical conditions. They can understand that they need certain things in order to survive, whereas the government does not know those things as well. So we look at a scenario where a parent goes to a doctor with severe symptoms. A children is actually able to give an outside perspective on the history of that parent, on the medical history. And so that is able to give doctors a better sense of what they need to do to actually care for that parent. Because recognize that in order to care, we need to provide the best information to care. And if the healthcare system receives that information, that is going to be the best outcome for these parents. Now, the second subtier for this analysis is that generalized care is always going to be worse and more expensive. I've already explained why children are the actors that best understand their parents and bring an outside perspective. But the thing that is important here is that we can actually give targeted care to these parents. We can give targeted support in times of need, because now we don't need to run 7 tests. We have enough information on pre-existing conditions to be able to run 1 test at a healthcare facility and know what's going on and understand how we can best help parents. And for all these reasons, I am so proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll do it.
Oh, no. Okay, judge ready?
Yes.
Team proposition ready? Yes, okay. Okay. Today, Team Proposition has failed to show us why such laws that are implemented need to be legally mandated. All the claims that they have asserted today show that relationships between parents and children exist. Yes, we can see to the fact that children and parents do have this emotional relationship, but today what they have failed to claim is why these laws need a legal mandation. All the assertions they have made today can be done without government interference. So today they have failed to fulfill their burden. They have failed to show why all the things they want to implement need to be legally mandated and why they can't just be mandated into today's current status quo. Today on Team Proposition, we would like to set some definitions, seeing as Team Proposition failed to do so. We would like to define filial responsibility laws as a legal obligation of the child to offer financial and social support to their parents. Our burden of proof today is to prove that the implementation of filial responsibility laws will not pragmatically or morally benefit the status quo. Now, first of all, we do not fully understand the substantiation of the policy presented today by Team Proposition, so we would like to define our framing of the motion. So the laws that we see that would be implemented today, laws are a standardized framework. So any responsibility put forward by the law must be tangible and quantifiable. So furthermore, under this paradigm, we can conclude and condemn with full assurance that filial responsibility laws would require a financial basis. Otherwise, they simply cannot be laws. There needs to be some quantifiable measure to implement them. And so furthermore, under this umbrella, they would require financial responsibilities. Now, even if they contest our definition of filial laws, right now, currently in the status quo, all responsibility laws which exist and which account for different human being mandate financial responsibilities as well. So these filial laws which we would mandate would also have to require responsibility laws, seeing that in the current status quo, all laws which account for responsibilities for another human being also require financial support. Now, before I move on to our case, I would like to engage in some rebuttals from the other side. So they said all of the assertions they made are extremely have a lot of hypocrisy in them, and they continually contradict themselves. So first, what they said was that that in our world today, people are moving away, individuality is growing due to liberal value spreading, and children are losing connection from their parents. However, then they also brought forward this substantive about how children know their parents best and how children can preemptively make decisions about their parents. So there's this huge juxtaposition of what they're saying. They're totally contradicting themselves, and they can't have it both ways. They also claim that children know their parents best about medical history and stuff, but by saying that, they are completely undermining institutions which exist in society. Hospitals already have medical files on stand. Hospitals already know the medical history of their patients. Children aren't the only ones who know things about their parents. The reason why people pay for things is so that they see the long-term benefits. They also don't seem to understand how the tax system works. The way taxes work are you pay for them during your lifetime, and you see the benefits from them once you retire. The taxes that you pay in systems such as Denmark, Sweden, which are socialist democracies, but also in like mixed economies or high tax economies such as in the US or Switzerland, all these countries, you pay taxes in order to see long-term benefits. Also, there are other institutions such as retirement homes, which are extremely important as well. They also talked about this whole reciprocity thing and about how parents provided the bare minimum for their child, so children must reciprocate as well. And we can see to this. We can see to the fact that children, yes, they do have the moral obligation to help their parents. However, we believe that this obligation does not need to be fulfilled under a legal framework. We believe that this emotional relationship should exist without legal obligations. But before I continue, I will take your point.
Should parents have a legal obligation to care for their children?
Parents do not have a legal obligation. Parents do have a legal obligation to care for their children. Child protective laws currently do exist in the status quo. And actually, my second substantive will further unpack this POI. So with that being out of the way, I would now like to unpack side opposition's case. So our first substantive is about financial infeasibility, where we demonstrate how implementation of such laws is simply economically and financially infeasible. Our second substantive is about how unnecessary, how the implementation of such laws would cause redundancy and restructuring costs. And our third substantive is about how these laws are amoral. Implementation of such laws removes the organic and emotional components of relationships. So now I would like to unpack my substantive about financial infeasibility. So the model this model is simply extremely untangible and economically unfeasible. Let's take the 4-2-1 model, which resulted from the one-child policy from China. The 4-2-1 model replicates 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 individual child. Now, this model shows how, because the older generations are bigger than the current younger generations, it is completely infeasible for us to expect that the younger generation will be able to fulfill the economic burden set by the older generation. Because first of all, birth rates are decreasing and life expectancy is increasing. This is exactly what side proposition told you as well. So if this is the situation, how do they expect that an individual born in a generation that's already smaller than the generation of their parents, how are they supposed to financially support themselves and also their grandparents and their parents? And furthermore, this would show you the stifling cycle of reduced birth rates, because if an individual is supposed to continually provide financial support to both their parents and grandparents, then it would also be extremely challenging for them to start up their own family, which would further continue stifling birth rates. Additionally, many rich families also begin losing inheritance over time. Families which were once extremely wealthy begin losing their wealth because wealth begins losing its value over time. So furthermore, this would show you how the already net decrease of wealth in a family would already prove to be extremely challenging for individuals born in younger generations, which is why it's furthermore, it shows you how increasingly unfair the situation is for the newer generation. We also want to highlight that this applies mostly to the middle or lower class, simply due to the fact that the middle and lower classes are much bigger than the upper class. And so currently in the status quo, there's not much upward movement or mobility for job occupations for the middle and lower classes. There's increased income inequality in the US and China, and children are not getting richer, so they can't support the increased number of dependents on their parents. I would now like to move on to my final substantive, which is about how implementation of such a model is simply unnecessary. So it makes social welfare completely obsolete. What's wrong about retirement homes? Current structures, such as the tax system, which they continually criticize, already offer an increased net benefit to individuals because they see long-term benefits. So by implementing such filial laws, we are simply making structures like these completely obsolete in countries such as Switzerland, Denmark, and Norway, as well as high income tax countries such as the US and Switzerland. Even in first world countries, if we take this to look at first world countries, first and foremost, first world countries already have laws such as child foster laws. However, child foster systems are continually underfunded. This is due to the fact that most people rely on the laws firsthand rather than the secondary child protective systems. So if we take the same logic and implement it to this current motion, we would see that if such laws were implemented, medical institutions would also begin losing their value and losing their quality due to funding restrictions. And for these reasons, we are extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
Hi, can we take our 1 minute of prep time?
It's already started.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Fifteen seconds.
Okay, can you begin, please?
Okay, may I begin? What we see is a world in which children have been gradually moving away from their parents in pursuit of more sort of city life, in pursuit of trying to further their careers, and have sort of left their parents in the dust. And we see that in many sort of societies where parents have relied on their children to take care of them, this is actually making life a lot harder for them and making it so they don't have even a basic quality of life. All side proposition is asking for in this debate is to provide these parents that basic quality of life, a roof over their head, food, those sorts of basic necessities that will keep them going and make sure that they're able to live the rest of their life in a comfortable manner. And that is what we are here to defend today. So with that, I'm going to be going through the points side opposition made and prove to you why our points still stand. So the first thing which we saw was that they claimed that we never explained why this had to be legally obligated. And what we're saying is oftentimes people shirk traditional values, especially in this age. People are going further away, people aren't really fulfilling their responsibilities. There's a reason that you have a legal obligation to take care of your kids and not just a traditional, oh, you should do it. The legal obligation ensures that these people receive that basic quality of life which is necessary for them. So with that, let's address their actual policy, right? Which is that all responsibilities should require a financial basis, and we completely agree with that. That's actually what our policy was doing as well. Our policy said just a basic quality of life, and it also said that we wouldn't deal with abusive parents, and that this would be settled through arbitration. So in the case where a parent wasn't meeting the minimum, where a kid wasn't meeting the minimum needs for taking care of their parent, essentially what we want is a sense of legal arbitration to arrive at a settlement which makes both parties happy. This is a non-adversarial method and makes it so that these parents are still being well taken care of. So with that, let's actually address some of the rebuttals which they brought to you on our case. So they tried to point out a contradiction, saying that we said individuality was growing, but children also say the parents know best. So actually, what we were trying to say here is that yes, individuality is growing. And in the past, when individuality wasn't as strengthened as it is now, kids used to take care of their parents. They used to be able to see their medical conditions. They used to have a much closer relationship, making it so that they were able to deal with these issues. But now, because of the individuality caused by these kids drifting away from their parents, we're actually seeing a decrease in that. These parents are sort of left to fend for their own. So what we're saying is if we return to a paradigm where there's this legal obligation, we're going to see that closeness return and essentially have the kids be better able to take care of their parents. So their next rebuttal was that we were going to be undermining the hospitals. But what we actually have to tell you is that the hospital system is completely inefficient if you don't have the proper information at the start. So doctors are afraid of being legally viable if they didn't correctly diagnose a patient. So what do they do when a patient walks in without much information? They run all the general tests to make sure that that patient is fit and healthy. But in our paradigm, we're going to have kids who are taking more attention of their parents, who are noticing these sort of paradigms and sort of making it so that they're able to provide that information so not as many tests are required. But a secondary response to this point is also that many times older people have been reluctant to go to the hospitals, whether it be a thing of the past or whether it be a thing of pride. They haven't been willing to take themselves there, and by the time they get to the hospital, it's already a serious condition which is significantly more expensive, or it might be even too late to save their life. In our paradigm, we're ensuring that they have a proper caretaker, and that's what's crucial to today's debate. So with that, we come on to their first substantive about financial feasibility, but before I get there, yes.
Why must children be incentivized to care for their parents under a legally mandated obligation instead of a genuine emotional connection?
Well, what we think is this emotional connection will follow the legally obligated mandate. For example, you yourself in a POI response said that kids should have a legal obligation to be taken care of their parents. Why do we not just rely on the emotional connection here? They never differentiated that. And what we're saying is that the legal obligation oftentimes spurns an emotional connection when you've spent enough time together. But I'll be further addressing this in my third substantive. So first, let's get back to their substantive, right? So they said in a program such as the one-child policy of China, it'll be impossible to take care of your parents. Well, two responses to this. One, the one world I mean, the one-child policy has been long discontinued and it was an outlier. Oftentimes parents do have two kids, but even in the paradigm where it's 1:2, so one child has to take care of two parents, we think that it's still reasonable to say that after the parents provided these people all their basic necessities, the arguments Raghav brought to you about reciprocity, we're able to fairly say that the kids should have to basically only ensure basic quality of life. They should ensure that these parents have a roof over their head. That's asking the minimum qualities, and that's something that we think is completely reasonable to say and shouldn't be that expensive. So with that, they say that it's harder to start up a family. But what we're saying is under our paradigm, actually, you're going to be less you don't need to save up for retirement to the same level where you did before, because now your kids are going to take care of you. So that means that you have extra money that you're able to free up to sort of spend on your children and provide a better quality of life. So with that, let's move on to their second substantive about implementation and about how it makes social welfare obsolete. What we think is this is actually going to strengthen social welfare, because what happens is resources are now being freed up. So when children are taking care of their parents, basically what's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot more resources available for a smaller pool. This is going to strengthen social welfare. So like when they talked about those orphanage homes, we think that those sorts of things will actually receive more funding in our paradigm, because social welfare has now more resources to deal with less people, making it so that overall the system is able to improve. So with that, I'm going to move on to my third substantive about familial connections. The thesis of this substantive is that implementing filial responsibility changes societal perceptions and creates a narrative that kids must take care of their parents. So the way that we want to go about proving this is proving that kids sort of have an emotional connection to their children, right? So initially, parents do have a legal obligation to their kids. They can't just leave them on the street. They have to take care of them. But while you're taking care of them, while you're with them, you're building an emotional connection. You do genuinely care for them. So we argue that a similar thing will occur in our paradigm. With this legal obligation forcing parents and kids to be closer, there's going to be an emotional connection that's built as well. Money doesn't always take away everything. We still see love between parents and children, while money is a huge factor. So we'd argue that the exact converse applies in this situation. So what this looks like in the real world is that right now we see that as people get to their middle ages around 30, 40, oftentimes they're neglecting their parents to focus on their own families. Their parents sort of go out of their lives, and that's something that we regret, because as these parents, the grandparents in this situation, are older, they actually care for their children the most, because this is when they've retired, this is when they have the most time. So by opening up this path, forcing a connection, we're making it so they're both more deeply interlinked and can have the opportunity to actually build an emotional connection. So because we're able to ensure more love between families, because we're able to ensure a better life for these elderly, and because we're able to ensure more resources in our societal welfare, I am so proud to propose. Thank you.
Guys, if you're confused, the motion is this one.
Can you turn your microphones off, please, until we start?
Can you mute your Yeah, it's filial responsibility.
15 seconds. Time.
Before a second speaker of team opposition, I will move into my own substantive about why it is fundamentally amoral and an inherent flaw on their side of the house to put a quantifier, an economic quantifier, on love and decrease the deontological quality of these filial relationships. I will first engage in some rebuttals. Fundamentally, as they said in their first speaker, and our first speaker brought up, but we have gotten no reply from their second speaker on this point. Their first speaker said in the first minute of their speech that fundamentally they believe in the modern world, prices are rising, taxes are rising, healthcare prices are rising. Yes, we conceded to this, but our first speaker came up here and pointed out to the judge and to Team Proposition that means that healthcare prices are also rising for the younger generation, that generation that has to take care of their parents. Yet for some reason, under Team Proposition side of the House, this somehow just simply not impact the younger generation. The younger generation can somehow now stomach their own rising bills and those rising bills of their parents. We fundamentally think this is unfeasible, and it only serves to better strengthen our point about economic feasibility. Next, second speaker of Team Proposition asked us to engage and delineate because we conceded that yes, there is a legal mandate for parents to take care of their children right now. And they asked us, please delineate how this is any different. Well, I'll tell you that. The difference is fundamentally right now, those legal laws, the laws that mandate parents take care of children are based on biology. They are fundamentally based on the fact that till you are 18 or 21, depending on what nation you are in, that fundamentally you are not biologically developed enough to care for your own self. Your brain, your prefrontal cortex that makes decisions, not developed enough to do that till you are 18. That is fundamentally why this responsibility exists. It is because of a biological incapacity. Fundamentally, we don't think this delineation has been made on Team Proposition side of the House. We asked them to tell us why fundamentally such biological incapacity exists in older parents who, I reiterate once and for all, are adults. They are considered legally adults. They are considered legally capable of caring for themselves. We fundamentally don't understand why this same biological incapacity addresses older people. Next, onto this idea of the 4-2-1 model, which we brought up, and they rebutted by saying, well, the one-child policy was just a thing in one country and it was decreased. Okay, even if you don't take care of your parents, and even if the one-child policy was only applicable to China, birth rates are still decreasing around the world. Even now, we learned in our social studies classes that younger generations are struggling to help the older generation simply because of, economic incapability. Fundamentally, this happens even without these laws. Also, we would like to note a major delineation between the two sides. Under our side of the House, we fundamentally think they've completely overlooked this. In the status quo, even in first world countries, which have implemented these so-called liberal values, which have caused children to, for some reason, I think they're framing it to be not care for their parents anymore. Even in first world countries such as the US, in which these liberal values have been implemented for years upon years, children still love their parents. They still want to care for them. We ask time and time again why this has to be specifically a legal mandate. They have outlined to you why it's different in the case of parents caring for children, and we once again ask them to engage as to why it has to be legally mandated that you care for your parents. Fundamentally, we believe children still love parents even in countries that implement liberal values, and they still want to help them. We think they've completely ignored this on this side of the House, and fundamentally in the status quo, when children still out of love want to help their parents, we see them having an economic incapability to do so. This worsens under their paradigm because an inherent harm on their side of the House is the fact that you apparently go to court over this. So if somebody is simply economically unable to support their parents, they now not only have to live with that shame and guilt for themselves, but they also get legal repercussions for that. We think that is frankly absurd, and they have completely overlooked the fact that children still want to help their parents. Also, on their side of the House, they kept outlining this inherent strengthening of an emotional bond, that as a child, because you're in close proximity to your parents, you form an emotional bond. Yes, we concede to this, but they say the same thing will happen once you grow older. But then we ask you, if this bond inherently formed is so strong as they've outlined time and time again, does it fade over time? What happens to that bond? We fundamentally don't see the need for strengthening of that bond. We simply don't believe that happens in the status quo. Before I move on to a few more rebuttals and my own substantive, yes, sir.
Now, you mentioned that elderly people are able to take care of themselves, and then you also talk about retirement homes. What if these people are unable to afford a retirement home?
Fundamentally, we think under this, as our first speaker outlined, in many countries, even those less developed, such as second or third world countries, you pay taxes fundamentally to see a return on that in the form of social welfare systems. Even if it is a bad social welfare system, fundamentally, the state provides for you in some capacity. That's what happens under our side of the House. Fundamentally, we would also like to reiterate time and time again that simply gaining individuality through liberal values doesn't inherently mean you stop caring for your parents. If this emotional bond that they claim on their side of the House is developed once you have to legally care for your child once they are young, we don't believe that loses strength over time. Also, one last point on this legal financial requirement. Fundamentally, we would like to reiterate to the judge and team proposition that older people are the ones who need medical care the most. Fundamentally, we think that's going to be expensive. We think that because social welfare systems such as retirement homes are used the most by older people because they have the most healthcare problems, they're the percentage of society that is most likely to face these problems. We think it's an inherent harm on our side of the house if the funding for such systems get cut, if the funding for systems such as healthcare benefits from the state get cut, because now it's a responsibility of the child. We think because this class of people is the most reliant on these healthcare benefits, we think that these systems cannot face a decrease in quality. We think fundamentally, in that case, those systems won't be able to manage these cases. Now, onto my own substantive, that of amorality. Fundamentals, we believe that right now in the status quo, there's a deontological bond between a child and a parent. We think they love each other. We think under proposition side of the house, what is happening is you're putting an economic cap on that love, and we frankly think that's kind of immoral. When we impose a legal obligation, think about it in the long term, what happens when new children are born? Say this law has been implemented for, 10 years. What happens to the next generation? They're incentivized to invest in their children when they're young, not out of love anymore, but now simply because they know, oh, well, we have to do something to gain a return on investment, fundamentally operating on the same premise that for some reason, if parents invest the most in their children as young people, they will get the highest return on investments. First of all, we'd like to point out a flaw in that reasoning, and there's no guarantee that if you invest more in your children, you will have that same return on investment. Second of all, we think even if that is the reason, we think that is more likely to be an inherent harm on their side of the house, because then parents are incentivized to do this out of some monetary gain. And look at love, familial love, a binding structure of society, as an economic commodity. We frankly don't think we need to outline where that is fundamentally amoral. We think you can't put that price on love, because in this case, we think this is a double standard. Also, we concede that yes, in the status quo, and we will, and I'll outline to you in the last seconds of my speech, why this is different from the legal responsibility parents carry for children right now. As I've outlined time and time again, that is because of an inherent biological incapability that children have. Because we don't think elderly people have that same problem, they don't have that underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, we fundamentally think that it's a double standard and it is fundamentally amoral to put this economic value and treat filial love as an economic commodity. And because of these inherent harms that I've outlined on proposition side of the house, we're very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did one after school yesterday. Coaching debate, coached debate 12 years in a This one's really different. Yeah. Oh, it used to be in Douglas. Why did they switch to Asian Parliamentary?
10 seconds. Time.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah, it seems we've been having some internet lag, so just please bear with us. There was some freezing through the last speech, and our Zoom call just gave us a connection that internet connection is unstable. Just letting you know in case something freezes in the middle.
Okay, I can hear you. Can you, and your connection looks stable from here. Did you hear enough of the speech?
Yeah, we heard the speech. There was just some video lag. We'll be fine. Thanks.
Video lag is fine, as long as you've heard the arguments. That's good. Should we start?
Okay, so I think it's important that at the beginning, we be clear about what the alternative that opposition is proposing actually looks like.
right? They're standing for the status quo, which has been so troubling in so many parts of the world that there have literally been near revolutions in trying to create a better standard of living for our senior community. This is an international problem that we're standing with as a society, and Team Opposition wants to come up here and say that everything is fine. Let's look at what this looks like for individual people, right? You have to save throughout your working life for your own retirement, knowing that your children might just move off to the city and not really care for you. And this will be more expensive for you in the long run because you can't invest in things over your own lifetime because you have to be constantly worrying about where that stream of income is coming for your retirement. And more importantly, you don't know how your lifespan varies much more widely these days than it did 30 years ago. You don't know how much time you're saving for. This is a very uncertain process as compared to relying on your children to support you in your old age, which they might have to sacrifice some things. We concede that they will have to spend some money on you, but at least they're more certain. They're working in that time, not working 50 years earlier for something you can't predict much later. Now, also, you're relying on Social Security, Medicare, retirement benefits, which are a one-size-fits-all system, and therefore much less efficient, much more expensive. And in addition, these systems have been disastrous at caring for our seniors in the sense that they're constantly overburdened, mostly due to the paradigms that opposition themselves has mentioned. And they haven't even suggested any mechanisms for making these systems work better for people in the long run. And for that reason, we don't think this is a particularly good way of doing it. So does the current system work? No, it explicitly does not. Medicare and Social Security are overloaded, and retirement homes are generally not looked at as a particularly good option for seniors because they don't get the one-on-one care they need in their old age. Elder abuse is common, and these are very inefficient. But let's say we accept their paradigm that the current system might be working. Now, their worst case, in their best case scenario, right? If you implement these laws, nothing happens because our arbitration courts say, yeah, the senior's happy, he's taken care of, there are no legal fees, there's no situation, and nothing happens. That's their best case scenario on this clash. Now let's look at the comparative between caring for your kids, which we know has a legal obligation, which they admitted in their first speaker via POI, that you do have a legal obligation to care for your kids. You don't just rely on the fact that parents love their kids, which we admit they do, but just in case, we have a legal obligation saying that you can't have child endangerment, you can't have negligence, those type of things. And they say there's a fundamental difference because parents are responsible adults and kids are young kids, right? But we'd also say that in society, we have to realize that a lot of these parents are equally helpless as kids. And how do we know this? Because no one chooses to be a dependent. If parents could live their entire life working, being active, caring for their own selves, why would they want to be dependent on the whims of their kid? Right? The reason that they have to rely on their kid is because they are helpless. We see mental acuity is decreasing, ability to care for yourself, physical strength, working ability, marketability of job, and ability to go with technology. All of these things make parents much more helpless and make the kid a necessary caretaker, not one that we can just rely on because of love. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Before that, I'll take a POI. Yeah.
Sir, could you please clarify how a legal responsibility, which both teams have conceded is a financial responsibility, makes a child more attentive towards their parents' medical history?
Right, okay, I will be getting to that in my third question. I'll be sure to signpost it to you when I do. So basically, I want to go on the clash on whether or not the kids can afford it. Firstly, we want to point out in your system, the kids have to save a lot more money for their retirement, and we both agree that costs are increasing. So that is going to be, in 50 years when the kids retire, that's going to be a lot more money than the money they're spending on keeping their parents right now. And in addition, it's uncertain. How long do they know they're going to live? They could be living 100 years with the elements of medical technology that we've obtained. It's much less expensive for them to care for their parents now and rely on their kids to care for their retirement when they are later. And we'll also point out that compare smaller generation, there was a very fair point brought up about how it's a 1-to-2 relationship. We point out, number one, that China's one-child policy is a fringe example, that we can't characterize the entire world as one kid for two parents. It's more likely to be 2 kids for 2 parents and thus equal, but we'll say that the cost of taking care of your parents with personalized care are decreased than relying on one-size-fits-all policies from the government in 50 years, no matter the case. Now, we'll also, and here I'll talk about why the legal mandate is important. Number one, we've suggested a non-adversarial process that opposition generally has not been willing to accept. Arbitration is a generally accepted legal form where, yes, you can exchange money. The mediator can decide what is the most important, what is the best case of everyone involved. If the child genuinely is homeless, can't afford it, the mediator isn't going to say you have to take everything you have and give it to your parents. That's how the mediation process works. We point out we're not hurting love in this case because we brought the comparison of children. It's not that just because parents realize they have a legal obligation to care for their children, they're like, I was gonna abuse my children before, but now that I have a legal obligation, now all my love is gone and I'm just focused on the complete cost and benefit analysis of whether or not we are going to, what our relationship is going to be. There's not going to be a difference when there is a basic bare minimum legal paradigm in the relationship between the parents and the children. And for that reason, we think that, and this is where I'm responding to your question, which is where the child is their ability to care for their parents, as I've said repeatedly, is based on their knowledge of the parent and ability to know, like, we know that adults are less likely to go to the hospital just because when they're in retirement homes, when they're in Social Security, when they're in Medicare, there are people who don't know them particularly well. Even if the child has become more distant, these are their parents. They've lived with them for 18 years at the very minimum. That will definitely have a greater connection than some person that the government has assigned to care for them in a retirement facility. We think that the children are the best caretaker in this paradigm. And honestly, even if you accept your best case scenario that everyone would care for their parents anyway, if one parent is left out of this responsibility by their children, that is a policy failure, especially since you failed to mention any harms. Like, would you make murder illegal just because most people wouldn't do it? Murder has to be a crime because it's important that no one does it ever. And we feel the same thing about parent abuse and elder abuse in this way. So we're cutting costs, we're putting the best caretakers in charge of parents, and they have advocated no substantial harms on what this policy would actually do other than a question of love, which I quickly addressed. For those reasons, I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
Fifteen seconds.
Hi, sorry, would it be possible for you to turn the camera a bit down? Team 86. Thank you.
Time.
Judges ready?
Yeah.
Timer ready? Timer? Timer? So I come from a Bangladeshi community, which was initially a very traditional and an Eastern community, but now it has been, there has been a greater shift towards individuality. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that I love my parents because of all they've done for me. And because of the very fact that I've lived with them, I'm a human being. In fact, we're not all robots who are motivated by economic justifications to take care of our parents or love our parents. And in fact, I would actually like to question this hypothetical. So if these laws did exist, I would actually experience some resistant psychological pressures, which is this idea that obligation creates resistance. And it would, if we reduce this emotional, connection, I would be less support oriented towards my parents and instead have to be motivated by these laws and by these obligations, which would take away from the emotional love and connection that I feel with my parents because I'm a human being after all. And now I would like to propose this dilemma to side proposition in today's debate. What if you don't have kids? What if parents don't decide to have children? We have outlined on our side how having these filial responsibility laws would lead to parents and society on a general relying on these laws to provide for these older people and these parents, and thereby decrease spending on welfare and these social services, thereby decreasing their quality. So therefore, if these parents don't have children in the first place, how would they be able to afford or be entitled to these retirement services and social facilities? Now, first of all, before I move any further, I would like to address some rebuttals and housekeeping. So basically, they have stated how they have asserted, in fact, how it is troubling for most old people to go into retirement and have a safe living standard. However, they haven't really delineated or substantiated why this is becoming a more relevant issue in the present status quo. And they haven't even given examples of what revolutions they're talking about related to this entire idea of retirement savings and older people having lower living standards. If we do take them on their best case and assume that increasing life expectancy does lead to some increasing savings planning uncertainty, we do have to acknowledge that this becomes an educational problem instead of being a filial responsibility problem. So therefore, we're not really focusing on the structural issues that delineate these problems within the current status quo, instead focusing on filial responsibility laws, which actually increase the burden on children themselves. So also, even if we do assume that the system is broke, and the old people are finding it harder within the current status quo, why don't we increase social security funding and pensions, which are the very root structural problems that we ought to focus on instead of focusing on filial responsibility laws? Now, with those out of the way, I would like to engage in some flashpoints of today's debate. Now, before I do that, I would like to engage in this delineation again, which has been proposed by the second speaker of our side, and which hasn't been engaged with the side proposition in today's debate. So parents are legally obligated to care for their children. We acknowledge that. However, the same doesn't apply to the other side because children are physically and mentally incapable of taking care of themselves comparatively to older people. So therefore, we cannot apply the same standard towards children taking care of their parents, and thereby this becomes a double standard fallacy that has been pointed out by side proposition. So now I would like to go into my clash points. So first of all, I would like to engage upon the issue of growing distance between parents. Now, you're saying that healthcare and welfare is increasing, and also the fact that you're conceding to the fact that people are paying taxes. They are investing in a future for themselves with the government. They're spending in social security, which is an inherent requirement in many countries mandated by the law. So how are living standards for parents decreasing at the same time as this? You're having it both ways on your side, and we do not simply agree with this. You're contradicting yourself, and we frankly believe that clarifying your position in reply speech would be quite too late. And now we would also like to say that this policy, if anything, is increasing the emotional distance between the children in the first place. So therefore, with this policy, you're actually making the situation worse. You're increasing the emotional distance. If there exists this problem within the current status quo, you're making it worse on your side. So even if we do assume on your best case that if there is no growing distance with this policy, we do have to acknowledge that there is an increasing burden on the children at the same time as we are distancing the children from their parents, as has been delineated by our first speaker with her substantive about economic infeasibility. But before that, I would like to ask for POIs if there are any on the floor.
Right, yeah. So retirement funds and Social Security have failed our elders. Elderly suicide rates have never been higher. What else do you plan to do to solve these neglected people's issues?
Thank you for your excellent POI. Okay, so let us assume for 1 second that older people are having greater emotional issues, right? They're finding themselves more emotionally distant from their children. However, we have delineated in the previous half of my speech that emotional distance simply increases with implementing this policy. So therefore, we do not really simply understand the relevance of your POI after I have said all that. Now, I would also like to engage with, are the children the best stakeholders? We would like to say that the medical history that exists within hospitals are the most accurate. And even if children are the best stakeholders to provide for this information, I have to say that the information, the medical history of the parents of these parents are more relevant than the medical history that these children can provide because of hereditary problems. I have seen Dr. House. I know what this is about. And therefore, I would like to say that, yes, the medical history of what these children provide are not that valuable in the first place. Now, with that, I would like to move on to the point about living standards, right? So we haven't still seen any valid justification on why the living standard of parents is decreasing on a whole. They have just made assertions on their part. We have stated that welfare and social security services are increasing on a whole. Thereby, we contend and continue to contend that parents are enjoying greater living standards in the current present status quo. And also, I would now like to summarize the entirety of our case in under two layers. The first one being principle. We are saying that that your side implementing this policy would be inherently amoral because you're reducing the inherent love that parents are feeling for their children. If we evaluate this dilemma from a deontological or first intention standpoint, parents are loving and caring for their children due to a long-term economic promise of some tangible gain instead of an inherent emotional love that parents feel for their children. This reduces the validity of these human relationships at the same time as induce some resistant psychological pressures on these children not to be help-oriented or support-oriented towards these parents. Instead, parents wouldn't be feeling an emotional support on their side, and they would instead all these financial supports you can provide them, but these parents, as the side proposition had said, suicide rates wouldn't keep going down because parents still wouldn't have that inherent emotional support. Thereby, we would like to say that we are the principled side in today's debate. Also, in terms of pragmatics, we are dividing the case up into two main levels. The first of financial infeasibility, mainly due to the 4-2-1 explanation by first speaker, as there are an increasing number of dependents for these children due to the decreasing birth rates around the world, as well as the lower upward mobility of the lower and middle classes, which constitute the greatest proportion of society as a whole on the present status quo. It is more likely because of these reasons that children on a whole have a harder time providing for their families. And we would also like to delineate that the majority, the entirety, in fact, of the case of side proposition has been contingent on the fact that we are looking at the rich upper 1%, the rich upper class strata of society as a whole, and thereby we're not focusing on these lower and middle class people. And also, the second layer is that of unnecessary. It reduces funding for welfare or social services, and it undermines the validity of the taxpayer system, making many of these services obsolete and thereby requiring restructuring costs as well as inducing several other negativities. For those reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
2 minutes prep time. Okay, you have 2 minutes prep time.
Judge, just so you are aware, we have a researcher here.
That's fine.
Around.
All right.
We just have research.
I think they do, but I don't know if they have.
10 seconds. Time.
As reply speaker on behalf of Team Opposition, I will be looking over a bird's eye view of today's debate and looking at the end of the day, which side truly fulfilled their burden of proof. We'd like to note to the judge that maybe this is a fault of Team Opposition, but we don't believe Team Proposition ever stated their burden of proof, but we think it was a pretty reasonable burden throughout the whole of this debate for them to explain why fundamentally implementing filial responsibility laws in the status quo would outweigh the inherent harms of such filial responsibility laws and why there would be more net benefit from these in the status quo. Our first speaker came up here today and said that the burden of proof on behalf of Team Opposition was to in fact prove that the implementation of filial responsibility laws will not pragmatically or morally benefit the status quo, as we have substantiated speaker after speaker. But as reply, I will also reiterate some rebuttals to the judge as well as a few clash points. From first speaker, we have come up here and said that, hey, this may be a theoretically great policy, even if it is, but it is fundamentally economically unfeasible. Both teams have fundamentally said that prices are rising. However, on Team Opposition, we have time and time again outlined to you why this is detrimental to the younger generation of the House. We have shown you why fundamentally it's not a sustainable model. On Team Proposition, on the other hand, they were willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the older generation and say, well, the new younger generation will just have to depend on their children. Our third speaker has pointed out an inherent harm in that, saying, well, what about if you don't have children in all these systems, which is in all the current social welfare systems, which will be another clash point that I will outline. Additionally, we have also outlined throughout our speakers other alternative models to fix this issue. We have conceded that, yes, we are the side that is defending the status quo flawed as it is. However, our third speaker has come up here and offered alternatives. They've said, okay, it seems like the issue Team Proposition is outlining is an educational one where people don't know how to save for retirement, or it seems like it's an issue of social welfare. And the best way we do this is by fixing these systems, not these filial responsibility laws, because those two solutions don't have the inherent harms Team Opposition has outlined today on the House. Second of all, finally, one last double standard in all of Team Proposition's case. They've said that fundamentally these laws will be the bare minimum, speaker after speaker. That's the extent of this economic feasibility. Yet speaker after speaker, they've simply asserted that the quality of care these parents will receive will go up even though children are supposed to be doing the bare minimum. Both sides have conceded that better healthcare is simply more expensive, which is why we reiterate that these economic harms are inherent on their side of the House. How are children who legally are mandated to do the bare minimum will offer somehow better care to their parents, even though it's economically impossible? We don't think that's going to happen. And fundamentally, that's an inherent double standard and harm on their side of the House. We don't understand how that works. Also, one last clash point, that of social welfare systems. Will they decrease in quality or increase upon the implementation of such filial responsibility laws? Our first speaker spent her full second substantive outlining why under the misuse of these systems, the funding for them will go down and the funding will be rerouted. However, second speaker of Proposition came up here today and said, no, we think they'll get better because less people will be using them, though they themselves conceded that they would face budget cuts. If these systems are facing budget cuts, then how are they going to function better when less people are using them? We think less people using a system is in fact the definition of an obsolete system. And we think under their side of the House, these benefits you get from the government are more likely to simply vanish and old people will be left to fend for themselves. Hence, throughout this whole debate, fundamentally, we believe the Team Proposition has come up here, Team Opposition has come up here today and fulfilled their burden of proof. We have shown you the inherent harms of implementing filial responsibility laws in the status quo. We've shown you why it's pragmatically unfeasible for the use of healthcare systems and economically, and we've also shown you why it's amoral throughout all of our cases, explaining why it decreases the inherent value of filial love. And because of that, we are very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm just gonna go inside. May I begin?
Yes.
Okay. So to start, we find it frankly unfair the amount of new information that is coming out in their third opposition speech when we have no opportunity to respond to it down the bench. So I'm going to highlight some of the new material which they brought up. First, starting with what happens if you don't have kids? This question didn't arise all the way until third opposition, never giving us a chance to respond to it. But our response to this actually did come out in second. If we can correlate our material where we were talking about how there will be more money available in the system, meaning that we can take care of these people, because the fact is less people are reliant on the system. But I will further explain this logic later in my reply speech. So next, they also brought up a completely new policy, as they admitted in reply, on improving Social Security, which again, we didn't hear till third opposition. It's really unfair to expect us to respond to these things when we don't have any time after their op block. So with that, I'm going to go into the stuff that actually did come out in this round, right? So with that, first, let's look at this idea of what the obligation is. So right now there's two paradigms. Side opposition would like to argue that the government faces the obligation to take care of these people, while side proposition argues that actually the children should be doing it. So why do we take this clash? We believe that the children should actually be doing this due to reciprocity. So this is the argumentation that came out in our first speaker's speech and was pushed down the bench. So it was basically saying that parents put everything they have into their kids. They put their retirement aside, they put everything aside in order just to take care of their kids. And now that it is the kids' turn to take care of their parents, we think that it's fair to say that they should at least have to do the bare minimum, that they should at least ensure that they have a roof over the head. So why is this better than what side opposition is proposing? This is better because right now the system is so overburdened in countries all over the world. This is analysis we brought to you about how there's a one-size-fits-all healthcare system that basically makes it so it's completely inefficient and that hospitals just don't have the resources to deal with these people. Now, if we add the kids into this equation, we're actually able to provide quality care that didn't exist before. So this is the reason that we wouldn't have these sorts of budget cuts, which they kept talking about. This is the argumentation we brought to you. People believe that they have an obligation to give back in a sense that they have a certain amount that they're paying through taxes and things, and that tax money goes towards Social Security. They're not simply going to cut it because kids are also taking care of their parents now. What we see is this actually builds a new narrative about the importance of taking care of the elderly, a narrative we didn't have before, and that narrative my third substantive clearly highlighted that went unresponded to. So the last major argumentation is about love, right? So this is their entire thing about being amoral. So with that, we again have two paradigms. A paradigm in which the parents are separated from their kids and have no real reason to maintain that connection in the worst case scenario on their world. And in our world, the worst case scenario is that they at least they have to talk. Because even if it might be just a financial obligation, there's proximity that they never had before. But on the spectrum, we actually think this proximity is going to create more care. Money doesn't just objectively ruin all relationships. When you're taking care of your kid, you still love them even though you're paying for them. They've provided no logic as to why we just turn kids into cash cows, and that's the only incentive. You still love your kid, and your kid is going to love you when you actually have this proximity and when you're forced to interact a lot. So we believe that we are able to show care. But even in the case that we are lost this clash, even in the case where they say that love is going to diminish on our side, we are providing quality life to people that didn't have it before. We are ensuring a basic standard of living that they never had, and I think that is crucial to today's debate. That is why we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good debate, guys.
Bye.